The 1972 election was between Richard Nixon and George McGovern. This was the election of foreign policy. It was all about Vietnam, detente, that Cold War era. This election was definitely famous for the Watergate scandal. It was when Richard Nixon was kind of affiliated with the break-in. And it resulted in, this was before the scandal kind of broke out, it resulted in a landslide victory from Nixon. He won, it was like one of the biggest win ratios that has ever been in a presidential election, I think, since. So the 1988 election was between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. So the main policy here, the main platform, what was mostly at stake was kind of ending the Cold War, was the US-USSR treaty, and that was definitely the main decider in who ended up winning. We went with consistency, as George H.W. Bush came after Ronald Reagan. He was his vice president. So you could really tell that the American people wanted that consistency through him, as Reagan had been pretty popular prior to him. So the 2000 election was between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And the main part of this election was presidential ethics, as this had just followed the Clinton scandal with Monica Lewinsky. The winner ended up being George W. Bush in one of the closest elections, much in contrast to Nixon. And it was so close that they needed to recount Florida, as that was the deciding state. So it ended up going in George W. Bush's favor. So the 2016 election, infamously between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, was one of the most divisive in American history. You really see America becoming divided and becoming very polarized to these two candidates, as both were seen as a little radical and a little bit kind of far to each side, along with being both very controversial candidates. So obviously they both had their individual kind of scandals, and it really showed that in the end, it was, again, one of the, just polarizing, and it really showed that America is being kind of pulled apart to these two very different edges, almost, these two extremes.
So the election of 1960 was between Richard Nixon for the Republicans and John F. Kennedy for the Democrats. So Nixon really was emphasized his decision-making experience and his this long resume of being a decision maker in the presidential office. He was the vice president before, and he had a lot of experience. Kennedy, he used his youth to build America. He signified a fresh start and a new beginning. In that time, in the 1960s, there's Cold War tensions, space race. We were really competing with the Soviets, and there's a lot of that going on. That was a pretty big issue in the election. Also in the 1960s, that was the election we first had televised debates, and that really aided to Kennedy's victory in that election, because he did look a lot better in TV. He just looked a lot healthier, he looked younger, and it really aided him. This was actually the smallest popular vote margin ever in an election. Kennedy won by 0.23% of the popular vote, but he had a pretty decisive win in the electoral vote. In the election of 1976, main candidates were Gerald Ford for the Republican Party and Jimmy Carter for the Democrat Party. Gerald Ford was a president in the previous term. He wasn't elected, he was just assigned to the presidency because the Nixon Watergate scandal cleared out the office and they needed a new person to step in. During his term, Ford had to deal with a slow economy, and that caused him to lose a lot of popularity during his election. And because of it, he pardoned Nixon of the Watergate scandal. He was seen as a Nixon supporter, and he didn't seem very trustworthy. Carter portrayed himself as untainted by Washington, and he was a completely fresh outsider to come in and have a fresh start for Washington. He sold himself as a reformer and just made it seem like he was going to bring America back to its honest self. So the 1996 election was in between the candidates of Bob Dole for the Republican Party and Bill Clinton for the Democratic Party. Dole was saying his main campaign was that Clinton was part of a spoiled baby boomer generation, and is that his own generation was like won World War II, and they might need to like be called in for service again to save America. And like his whole campaign was just wanting to save America and bring it back to his glory days. Clinton said that Dole was like old and kind of questioned the validity of his ideas, and there's a lot of stuff like that. Some of the important issues of this election were gay men and lesbian women rights in the military. Clinton supported them being allowed openly in the military. That was a pretty controversial decision at the time. The election in 2012, the main candidates were Mitt Romney for the Republicans and Barack Obama for the Democrats. Barack Obama was the previous president for the previous election, 2008, and he was running again. For both of these candidates, the majority of their campaigns were negative towards each other, kind of marking a shift of campaigning. And the most important issues of the time were the economy coming off the dot-com bubble, the dot-com bust, and like the house market crash, 2008, and also foreign policy like nuclear Iran and all that stuff.
The election of 1964 came directly after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And in this election, Lyndon B. Johnson won in one of the biggest landslides ever recorded in American history over the other candidate, Barry Goldwater. In the election of 1980, Reagan won in a landslide over Jimmy Carter, who was the incumbent president. And this went in the complete opposite direction, partisan-wise, as compared to the election of 1964. In the election of 1992, this was a closer election than some of the previous ones, and Bill Clinton ended up winning this one. This marked an increasing closeness in the elections in years to come, and also the end of dominance within the Republican Party. In the election of 2008, President Barack Obama won against John McCain in a pretty definitive win. This was the first African-American president, and he won with 69.5 million popular votes, which was the greatest turnout that had ever happened, and this would only be beat in 2020.
The 1968 election featured two candidates, the first one being Richard Nixon for the Republican Party and Hubert Humphrey for the Democratic Party. The problems in America at the time included MLK Jr.'s assassination, which was 3 years prior to the election, which sparked riots in a bunch of cities, as well as radical college students taking over campus buildings, as well as around 500,000 Americans in war at Vietnam. Richard Nixon won the election in a landslide, according to electoral votes, in which he won 301 and Hubert Humphrey won 191. However, the percentage of total votes was 43.4 to Richard Nixon to 42.7 to Hubert Humphrey. The 1984 election included candidates Ronald Reagan for the Republican side and Walter Mondale for the Democratic side. In America, the problems consisted of the New Right, which were Christian evangelicals who were trying to become prominent more in political elections, as well as the Cold War, which was still very prominent and a big conflict of the time, and the end of the Vietnam War. Ronald Reagan, while winning 58.8% of the votes in total, won the electoral votes 525 to Walter Mondale's 13. The 2004 election included the candidates George W. Bush as well as John Kerry. The major problems in America of the time were foreign policies as well as terrorism and 2003 invasion of Iraq, as well as many other wars fought out in the Middle East, such as Afghanistan. George W. Bush for the Republican Party and John Kerry for the Democratic Party had a much closer election in which Bush won 286 of the electoral votes and Kerry won 251. The 2020 election between Joe Biden for the Democratic Party and Donald Trump for the Republican Party, where Donald Trump won 46.9% of the votes and Biden won 51.3% of the votes, resulted in Biden taking home 306 electoral votes, as well as Trump taking home 232 electoral votes. At the time, the issues in America consisted of healthcare, civil rights, immigration, gun violence, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. The overall trends of the past those four elections included a growing split between Nixon and Reagan's dominance, as Nixon and Reagan both won their elections in pretty big landslides, while Bush and Biden won theirs by a slight margin. On top of that, America also supported candidates running for re-election, as well as candidates that were proven political leaders. Finally, the United States leaned more Republican, as 3 of the 4 presidents in those elections, Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, were all Republican, while Biden was only Democratic to win. However, Biden only won because Trump was very unpopular with the country after his term.
Now, with all these trends and developments in consideration, what will be the result of the 2024 election? To me, there's a clear trend. Politics have gotten more and more polarizing as the nation grows more and more divided.
This is what allowed people like Trump and Hillary to be nominated.
The chances of Trump himself running another time is very likely. More importantly, however, is that due to the unpopularity of Biden's term, the Republican Party will most likely win if Biden is a Democratic nominee.